Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to a brand new episode of Serial Saturday. This is part 2 of the Willie Pickton story, so if you haven't seen part 1 yet, I highly recommend checking that one out first, otherwise you're going to be pretty lost. When we left off last week, Willie had just been rearrested and charged with murder, and police were in the process of searching his property. Then in January of 2003, Willie's preliminary trial began, and it lasted until July of that year. During the preliminary trial, Willie's previous charge of attempted murder was brought up, and this time, Willie's 1997 attempted murder charge of Wendy Lynn Eistetter was discussed, and this time, Wendy testified. Also, remember I vaguely mentioned that police had kept a hold of Willie's clothes and boots from that incident, and it had been sitting in a storage locker this whole entire time. Well, in 2004, they finally sent the clothes and boots off to a lab, and it turns out one of the items seized had DNA evidence from not one, but 2 women. Then finally, on January 30th, 2006, Willie's trial begins in New Westminster. Willie pleaded not guilty to 27 charges of first-degree murder, though one of the counts was later rejected on the grounds of lack of evidence. Now, I'm not super privy on Canadian law. I don't even know that much about US law, to be honest with you, but apparently there's something called the voir dire. I have no idea if I'm saying that right, but it is evidently a legal phrase for a variety of procedures connected with jury trials. But this phase of the trial took close to a year just to determine what evidence the jury should be able to see or hear. Justice James Williams was presiding over the hearing, and on August 9th, he decided to sever the charges into 2 groups. One of 6 and one of 20. The trial was then set to proceed on the group of 6. And then the remaining 20 could have been tried at some point, but those counts were ultimately stayed on August 4th, 2010. So basically, while he could still have a new trial for those 20 charges, it's likely he never will, and it's just kind of given that he committed the murders, you know? So we don't really need to go through a whole nother trial to convict him when we already know he did it. But basically the reason why the judge did it is because he thought that trying all 26 charges would just be too much for the jury because the trial could have lasted up to 2 years, thus also increasing the chance for a mistrial. So I get it. The judge also said that the 6 counts he chose to be tried at this particular moment had materially different evidence than the other 20 counts. I don't know exactly what that evidence is. I wasn't able to uncover anything substantially different about these 6, other than I think that these 6 specifically, they found the remains on the farm? I don't know. We'll get there. Finally, on January 22nd, 2007, the jury trial begins. Willie is facing first-degree murder charges in the deaths of Marnie Lee Fay, Georgina Faith Papin, Brenda Ann Wolfe, Andrea Josbury, Serena Abotsway, and Mona Lee Wilson. Now, the jury learns the gruesome details of what was discovered during the police investigation. And I'm going to warn you, this is going to get pretty gory, gruesome. I would suggest, if you are sensitive, to skip forward. But they found skulls cut in half with hands and feet stuffed inside of them. The remains of one victim were found stuffed inside of a garbage bag, while her bloodstained clothes were found in Willie's trailer. Part of another victim's jawbone and teeth were found next to Willie's slaughterhouse. And the strangest thing police found was a .22 revolver with a dildo attached to it. And the dildo, not only the DNA of a victim, but also Willie's. I don't even know what to do with that. A lot of the evidence came from Willie himself. Because remember how he just spilled his guts to his cellmate, who actually was an undercover officer? A lot of his confession was on tape. So a lot of this was played for the jury. And in one of those tapes, Willie claimed that the dildo had been attached as a makeshift silencer. Moving on. Then in October of 2007, a juror is accused of having made up her mind that Willie is innocent. Not guilty, is innocent. Yes. You heard that correct. Innocent, not guilty. At which point the judge questioned said juror. The juror completely denied this accusation, and Justice Williams ruled that she could stay on the jury because it had not been proven to him that she had made this statement. On December 6th, 2007, Justice Williams suspends jury deliberations after he discovers an error in his charge to the jury. As it turns out, earlier in the day, the jury had submitted a written question to him requesting a clarification of his charge, asking, are we able to say yes, find Willie guilty, if we infer the accused acted indirectly. Then on December 9th, the jury returned a verdict that Willie is
not guilty
on 6 counts of first-degree murder. Instead, they found him guilty on 6 counts of second-degree murder. And on December 11th, after reading 18 victim impact statements, Justice Williams sentenced Robert Willie Pickton to life with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the maximum punishment for a second-degree murder conviction. Basically, he received the same sentence that he would have if they would have convicted him of first-degree murder, and I kind of think that that was kind of the judge's way of saying he thought that he should have been convicted of first-degree murder. I really do not get how they did not convict. How do you not convict him of first-degree murder? Clearly he did it. There is substantial evidence here, and literally dozens and dozens of missing women that he claims responsibility for. I don't understand. So by now you're probably wondering who the victims are, and I got a good long list here of the victims. So, let's get into it. Andrea Joesbury was 23 years old when she went missing in June of 2001. She grew up with a very difficult home life, and at 16 years old, she found a boyfriend who persuaded her to run away with him. She thought it seemed like the perfect escape, but it was the exact opposite. Her boyfriend was a drug dealer who wound up getting her hooked on the products he was selling, which ended up with Andrea on the streets selling herself to support her new habit. She ended up working for a series of pimps who violently abused her. And when she was last seen in June of 2001, Andrea had a daughter. Serena Abotsway was 29 years old when she disappeared on August 1st, 2001. While she never had much of a chance at a life, she managed to make the best of it. Serena was born with fetal alcohol syndrome in a bad area of town. Both of her biological parents passed when she was young, thrusting her into the foster care system. She was with a family from the ages of 4 to 17, and they did the absolute best they could with her, though she was a difficult child. Eventually, they decided they couldn't keep her any longer because she was prone to violence, and they ended up placing her in a group home where she was introduced to drugs and a lifestyle that would eventually lead to her living on the streets. She was a very strong advocate for women, and in the 80s and 90s, when she noticed them starting to disappear, she often spoke up at rallies where she demanded action. Sadly, though, her remains were dug up and identified at the Pickton farm. Marnie Lee Frey seemed to have it all as a child. She came from a loving home and a family that supported her, and she even attended a Christian school. But when she had her daughter at 18 years old, her life changed completely. She was lured into the world of drugs by a local gang and wound up on the streets of Vancouver, selling her body to maintain her habit. Though she always found time to call home, sometimes even up to 8 times a day, to see how her little girl was doing. Sadly, her last call home came September 4th, 1999, and her remains were later found on the Pickton farm as well. Georgina Faith Papin and her 8 siblings were put into foster care when she was very young, therefore she never really got to know her real family. And by the time she was 18, she had bounced from home to home and admitted herself to having an on-again, off-again addiction to drugs. But she always found time to contact her daughter who lived with her grandmother, though she had 7 children herself in total. But due to her lifestyle, which included some prison time, she did not have custody of any of her kids. In March 1999, Georgina told her daughter she wasn't feeling well and that she planned to check into a local care facility, though she was never seen again. Mona Lee Wilson was removed from a First Nations reserve in Alberta to find a life that varied in times from extreme happiness to outright misery. As a young girl, she lived in a treatment center, but she was taken out after being found badly beaten in a hallway. She was placed with a foster family where she stayed from the ages of 8 to 14. This family nurtured her and gave her possibly the only real love she would ever know. She was then placed with a single mother and her 14-year-old son, and this turned out to be a not so good situation for her. So just 2 years later, she found herself living on her own in Vancouver, turning to heroin to hide her pain, and prostitution to help finance her lifestyle. She disappeared November 2001 at the age of 26, just as she was trying to kick the habit and turn her life around. Brenda Ann Wolfe disappeared February of 1999, though she would not be reported missing until April 25th, 2000. Not much is known about how she ended up on the streets of Vancouver's east side. She was briefly addicted to drugs, but by the time she disappeared, she seemed to have turned her life around, working as a waitress and a bouncer in a local eatery. She was never a prostitute herself, and in fact had a reputation of being a street enforcer to defend the prostitutes if they were attacked. And those are the 6 victims that he was officially found guilty of second-degree murder for. And now we're going to move on to the other 21 victims. I'm not going to go into as much detail with them. I just really wasn't able to find as much. Jacqueline Michelle McDonell was 23 years old when she was last seen in January 1999. Diane Rosemary Rock was 34 when she was last seen on October 19th, 2001. 27-year-old Heather Kathleen Bottomley was last seen and reported missing on December 13th, 2001. Heather Lynn Furminger was last seen in 1999. Helen Hallmark was last seen August of 1997. Patricia Rose Johnson last seen in March of 2001. 30-year-old Heather Chinnock was last seen in April of 2001. Tanya Holyk was 23 when she was last seen in October of 1996. 24-year-old Sherry Irving was last seen in 1997. Inga Monique Hall was 46 when she was last seen in February of 1998. Tiffany Drew was last seen in December 1999. Sarah D. Vries last seen April 1998. Cynthia Feliks last seen December 1997. Angela Rebecca Jardine was last seen November 20th, 1998, between 3:30 and 4 o'clock p.m. at a rally in downtown East Side at Oppenheimer Park. Diana Melnick was last seen in December 1995. Deborah Lynn Jones, December 2000. Wendy Crawford, December 1999. Carrie Koski, January 1998. Andrea Faye Borhaven was last seen in March 1997. Cara Louise Ellis, aka Nikki Trimble, was 25 years old when she was last seen in 1996, but she wasn't reported missing until October of 2002. And interestingly enough, Cara and Andrea, the last 2 I just mentioned, were the ones whose DNA was found on Willie's items of clothing that they seized in 1997 following the second-degree attempted murder of Wendy. I thought it was very odd that those 2 were not included in the original 6 because they had DNA evidence, you know? So, yeah. And lastly, we have a Jane Doe, and her charge was the one that was later lifted after Willie refused to enter a plea on the charge involving this victim. He was also implicated in the murders of the following victims, but charges have never been laid for them, and this is also an incomplete list. Mary Ann Clark, aka Nancy Grace, who disappeared in August 1991 from downtown Victoria when she was 25. 33-year-old Yvonne Marie Bowen was last seen March 16th, 2001, and reported missing on March 21st. And lastly, Dawn Teresa Cray, who was reported missing in December of 2000. In total, 3 appeals have been filed in this case to the BC Court of Appeal. The first one was made by the prosecution and allowed on the grounds that the trial judge had made a mistake in excluding some evidence and in splitting the charges. Basically, this appeal was really just a way for the prosecution to say,
hey, if Willie files an appeal, we want it on record that we're taking issue with the way the original trial was held, and quite possibly if things had been done differently, he would have been found guilty for first-degree murder.
Shortly after that appeal was filed, an appeal was filed by the defense and rejected. The defense then filed another appeal with the Canadian Supreme Court, which was also rejected. Robert Willie Pickton remains incarcerated today. The RCMP and Vancouver police have received some serious criticism following this case, mainly about how they withheld information from each other, thus resulting in Willie possibly getting away with this for much longer than he should have. The Vancouver police were also criticized for not taking action sooner and not taking the disappearances of so many women seriously. As a result, on September 27th, 2010, the Missing Women Commission of Inquiry were ordered to evaluate the response of law enforcement to reports of missing and murdered women. It concluded in December of 2012 and outlined 63 recommendations. Though the inquiry itself itself received criticism from various civil society groups as well as indigenous communities regarding its investigative structure, as well as the lack of government action after the inquiry to fulfill its recommendations. The inquiry said there were blatant failures by police, including inept criminal and investigative work, compounded by police and societal prejudice against sex trade workers and Indigenous women, thus leading to a tragedy of epic proportions. The inquiry had 4 mandates: to evaluate the response of the police to reports of missing women from downtown Eastside Vancouver, evaluate the reason for staying the charges against Robert Pickton in January of 1998, recommend changes regarding how missing women and suspected homicides are handled, and finally to recommend changes to how cases are handled when they involve more than one investigating organization. It also called for adequate funding for emergency shelters for women in the sex trade, as well as compensation for children of women who are missing. The Vancouver Police Department claims to have used this inquiry to implement techniques and such, but I don't know. I mean, I really hope that they did, because the Robert Pickton case was a shit show. Let's be real. The inquiry's executive report notes that Indigenous women experience a heightened vulnerability to violence. They disproportionately face higher rates of violence with harsher severity. It also found that Indigenous women are approximately 33% of the cases of missing people, despite only making up 3% of the population. Additionally, it found that Indigenous women have increased susceptibility to violence and other violent crimes, such as sexual assault and murder. Wow, what? It's only what you've been being told for a really long time. Honestly, there's really just not enough time to talk about all this. I highly recommend looking into all this on your own. I know that finally a lot of this stuff is coming into light. I mean, the fact that they have clear-cut evidence from years and years and years and years and years ago, and it is now 2021, and they're finally being like, hey, wait, that's a problem. It's a problem in and of itself, you know? So I kind of want to do a whole thing on this. Maybe not necessarily the Canadian part of it, but like here in the US, it's just a real problem. And yeah, let me know if you'd like me to talk more about this kind of thing in the future on Serial Saturday, as well as any other recommendations for Serial Saturday topics. I do have a couple planned for the next few episodes, so it'll be a minute before I get to them, but I really would love to hear what you guys would like to hear me talk about. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you stay away from those creepy pig farmers, because you just might end up like one of Robert Pickton's 49 victims. And with that, bye!